Her Apache tribe said she was useless without legs and left her in the snow to die. Only a lonely farmer ever stopped to help. Before we start this Western love story, hit like and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps the channel. The winter of 1872 had northern Wyoming locked in ice. Snow lay in rough, crusted sheets over open fields. Sagebrush and leaning fence posts stuck up like black scratches against white. The air bit the inside of your nose when you breathed. Every step on the hard snow sounded too loud in all that emptiness. On mornings like this, the silence could dig into a man's thoughts. Calder Boone didn't give it the chance. He focused on the simple things he could control: one breath, one step, the weight of the rope at his belt, the steady swing of his arms. Calder was 39, tall and narrow-hipped, lean from work instead of vanity. In his earlier years, he'd ridden as a border scout, tracking raiders by moonlight, reading sign on the ground that most men never noticed, watching people die faster than he could remember their names. That work had kept him alive and filled his mind with things he didn't want to see anymore. When he finally walked away from it, he used his saved pay to buy a small homestead. He chose a place far from towns, far from saloons, far from the noise and the orders and the blood. Out here, his life was simple: keep the land alive, keep himself alive, and let the rest of the world do whatever it pleased. That morning he was following coyote tracks along the frozen creek. The coyotes had been slipping too close to his chicken coop at night. He wasn't out for sport. He just wanted to know where they crossed the water, how many there were, and what they'd learned about his place. Routine kept his hands busy, and his thoughts from circling back to men he hadn't managed to save. The sun was low when he reached the creek line. Wind slid over the ice and lifted thin veils of snow, dragging them along the bank with a dry whisper. Calder crouched and studied the ground. Coyote prints, small, sharp, right where he expected them. Then he saw something else, a deeper mark cut across the tracks, not footsteps, a drag, a long, crooked groove through the snow, as if something heavy had been pulled forward by hand or by someone with nothing left to stand. On Dot, his stomach tightened. He'd seen trails like that as a scout, leading away from battlefields or burned camps. They never ended well. Calder followed the drag without speaking. His shoulders stayed loose but ready, breath even, one hand resting close to the coil of rope at his belt. The marks led toward a small stand of bare cottonwoods, where the wind cut straight through the branches. Near a bend in the creek he saw a dark shape crumpled in the snow, half buried by drifting powder. He slowed automatically. Even years away from raids hadn't shaken the habit. Step by step, he closed the distance, ready for movement that never came. That it was a woman, young, Apache. Her long black hair had frozen into stiff strands across her face. Her brown skin had gone a dull gray from the cold. Her lips were cracked, her lashes rimmed with ice. Her chest moved so little he had to watch for several seconds, just to be sure she was breathing at all. Calder dropped to one knee beside her. The hides wrapped around her lower body were soaked stiff. When he lifted the edge to check for wounds, his throat locked. There were no legs beneath the cloth, just two stumps ending above the knee. Old scars showed where someone had cut to save her life. Rough wraps of cloth and hide held the bandaged flesh together, but the skin around it was dark and angry from the cold. Calder had seen fast field amputations like that done with whatever knife a man had. When infection or bullets left no better choice, he scanned the land around them, looking for any trace of her people. No pony tracks, no boot prints, no camp. Only the long trail where she had dragged herself alone through the snow. They had left her. On purpose. A faint tremor shook her shoulders, more reflex than movement. Her eyelids fluttered, and for a split second he saw her eyes dark, dazed, full of pain and disbelief. Calder made his choice in that instant. No weighing pros and cons. No thinking about what trouble might follow. He'd learned years ago that hesitation killed people just as surely as bullets did. He slid his arms beneath her and lifted. She weighed almost nothing. Parts of her body were stiff as boards, other parts shook uncontrollably. When her head fell against his chest, he felt just how deep the cold had settled inside her. People didn't always come back from cold like that. As he turned toward his cabin, His mind settled into the old clear rhythm from his scouting days. Young, alone, legs gone, abandoned, time nearly run out. If he didn't move fast, she would die here on his land, and he'd be the man who walked past. The wind hammered his face as he crossed the open field. But Calder didn't slow. Fear wouldn't help her. Panic wouldn't build a fire or heat water. Get her inside, get her warm. Then, if she lived long enough to ask questions, he could figure out what it meant to share his silent life with a stranger who had been thrown away by her own people. By the time Calder reached the cabin, his arms burned from the effort and his lungs felt scoured by the cold. The small log house came into view through the blowing snow, a low, sturdy shape he'd built with his own hands. Smoke drifted thinly from the chimney, nearly lost in the wind. He shouldered the door open and stepped inside, swinging it shut with his heel to keep the storm out. At once the faint warmth of the room hit him, a thin layer of heat from the banked fire in the stone hearth. He laid the Apache woman gently on the narrow cot beside the fireplace. The straw mattress rustled under her slight weight. For a moment he just stood there, jaw tight, eyes on her face. Her lips were nearly blue. Her fingers were stiff and waxy at the tips. No time to stare. He moved fast. He threw more logs onto the struggling fire, stacking them carefully so the flames could catch. Then he grabbed an iron kettle, scooped clean snow from a barrel by the door, and set it near the flames to melt. The motions were automatic. He'd done them alone 1,000 times. Only this time, someone else's life depended on how quickly the room warmed up. When the fire began to crackle higher, he turned back to her legs. The stumps weren't bleeding, but the skin around them had gone dangerously dark in places, mottled with purple from the cold. He pushed the cloth aside, just enough to see. Months old, he thought. Healed, but not strong. Winter travel could split that skin open again in a heartbeat. He felt eyes on him and glanced up. Hers were barely open, just slivers of dark watching him from under heavy lashes. There was fear there, but more than that, confusion. Like she was still trying to decide if he was real. "They left me," she whispered, the words scraping out of her raw throat. Calder pulled a rough wool blanket from the foot of the cot and wrapped it around her shoulders, tucking it close. "Who?" he asked quietly, though he already knew the answer. "My people." Her jaw tightened. "I slowed them down," she swallowed, eyes drifting toward the covered stumps. "They said I'm useless now." The words hit him harder than he liked. He'd heard officers say almost the same thing about wounded men to shot up to ride, too broken to march, men who got left behind when the column needed to move fast. The faces came back uninvited. The ones he hadn't been able to carry. The ones he'd told himself he couldn't save. Calder sat on the edge of the cot, steadying himself before he spoke. "You're not dead," he said, voice low but firm. "Whoever said you were useless was wrong." She blinked slowly, as if she didn't know what to do with that. As if the idea that someone disagreed with her tribe hadn't even occurred to her. He didn't stay in her line of sight long. He rose and turned back to the fire, letting the flames pull his focus. Having her here, bleeding memories loose inside him, scraped against scars he'd spent years ignoring. Men shouting orders, men begging for help he couldn't give. The sick weight of walking away. He shut it down, one thing at a time. Warm water, clean cloth, steady hands. He dipped a rag into the now melted snow, tested the temperature, then knelt by the cot again. He wiped the frost from her face, her neck, her arms, working carefully round the bandages at her legs. He moved without hurry, but without wasted motion. He wasn't gentle in a soft, talking way. He was gentle in the way a man is when he knows how fast life can slip away. The cabin filled with the sound of snapping logs, the soft clink of the kettle, and her uneven breathing. No more words for a while. As the minutes passed, her breathing shifted. Still shallow, still weak, but not so close to disappearing. Her eyelids sank and lifted in slow, heavy blinks until finally they closed and stayed that way. Calder eased another blanket over her, checked that no drafts were sneaking in around the shutters, and settled himself into the wooden chair by the hearth. The firelight painted the room in shades of orange and gold. A clock on the wall ticked steadily, another small rhythm in a life he'd kept quiet for years. Now there was one more rhythm under his roof, hers. He watched the rise and fall of her chest longer than he intended, feeling something heavy press against his ribs. Responsibility. He hadn't asked for it. He hadn't wanted it. But walking away had never been an option. Warm her. Feed her. Give her time. He muttered under his breath. Expect nothing back. Outside, the wind dragged its fingers along the cabin walls. Snow piled against the logs. Inside, he fed the fire until the flames burned strong, keeping the room just on the safe side of cold. Sometime deep in the night he dozed off in the chair, boots still on, one hand resting close to the fire poker out of habit. Every time he jerked awake, the first thing he did was listen, her breathing. Still there. By the time a thin band of gray light cut through the frost-coated window, the worst of the danger had passed. Not all of it, but enough. Calder rose with a stiffness that reminded him he wasn't a young scout anymore. He checked the fire, then moved to the cot. Color had started to creep back into her cheeks, faint but real. Her lips weren't as blue. When he laid the back of his hand against her forehead, he felt warmth, not fever hot, but human. He let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. The day had barely begun, but something in his life had already shifted. He didn't live in an empty cabin anymore. A stranger lay under his roof, one he couldn't ignore, and one he had no intention of abandoning to the snow. Daylight slipped quietly into the cabin, a narrow gray beam stretching across the wooden floor and brushing the edge of the cot, where the Apache woman lay. Calder stood near the hearth, testing the heat of the kettle he'd left by the fire. The quiet of the room felt almost strange, thin, careful, as if the cabin was holding its breath right along with him. He hadn't slept much. He drifted in and out in the chair, waking every time the fire dipped to low, and every time he opened his eyes, he checked her breathing first. It had been years since he'd cared about anyone's breath but his own. Now, as the morning cold pressed against the walls, he stepped closer to her. Her face held more color. Not much, but enough to ease something tight in his chest. Her breathing came deeper, steadier. She didn't look like someone trapped on the thin edge between life and slipping away. She stirred under the blankets, her fingers twitching. Then her eyes blinked open, clearer than the night before, still full of pain, but focused enough to understand she wasn't outside anymore. Calder crouched beside her. "You awake enough to drink?" he asked, voice even. Her eyes scanned the cabin slowly, the walls, the beams overhead, the table, the place where he'd slept in the chair. She looked like someone piecing together a world she didn't recognize. Then her gaze settled on him. "Yes," she whispered. Calder slid an arm under her shoulders and lifted her just enough to sip from the cup he held. Warm broth touched her lips, and she drank in small, trembling swallows. Her fingers curled weakly against his coat sleeve, not grabbing, just steadying herself. When she finished, he eased her back onto the pillows. She watched him for a long moment, studying him the way a wounded animal studies a man holding out a hand, unsure if he's offering help or preparing to strike. "My name is Asha," she said finally, her voice small but firmer than before. Calder nodded once. "Calder Boone." She kept staring, waiting, and he realized she wanted more than just his name. "This is my land," he added. "Been here a few years. You're safe." Her jaw tensed at that last word. Safe, as if the idea felt strange in her mouth. "How long were you out there?" Calder asked. Asha swallowed hard, eyes drifting toward the window where the pale morning light cut in sharp. "Almost 2 days," she said. "After they left me, I tried to follow. Snow covered the trail. I crawled until I couldn't feel anything." Calder felt a familiar weight press behind his ribs, the same weight he used to carry when he found wounded soldiers a moment too late. "You shouldn't have been alone," he said. Quietly, Asha's expression shifted: anger, shame, resignation. "I slowed them," she said. "I fell behind after the raid. My legs." She stopped, staring toward the hidden stumps beneath the blankets. "They said it was better for the tribe if I stayed behind." He didn't interrupt. He didn't try to give comfort she wasn't ready for. He understood too much about the brutal math people make in survival tribes, armies, settlers. They all left someone behind eventually. "I kept moving until the cold took everything." She murmured, "I thought the river might take me first. You made it farther than most would." Calder said. She blinked, surprised by the tone. It wasn't praise. It was fact. The kind of thing a man says when he's seen too many give up too soon. Asha looked at him differently now, not with trust, but with recognition. To people who had been cut by the world in ways that didn't disappear. Wind hammered against the cabin walls, reminding them both how close she'd come to dying out there. Calder stepped to the shutter and pushed back the snow that had wedged into the frame overnight. "You live here alone?" she asked behind him. He nodded. "Been that way a long time. Why?" Calder hesitated, a short breath slipping out before he answered. "I've seen more killing than a man ought to carry," he said. "Came here to quiet it." Asha watched him with a strange sharpness, as if she understood more than he offered. Maybe she did. Some wounds recognized each other. He checked the blanket again, making sure it wrapped around her properly. "You stay until you get your strength back," he said. "No hurry." Her fingers tightened around the fabric. Fear, uncertainty, maybe both. "I don't want to be a burden." "You're not," he said immediately. He didn't soften it. He didn't say it for comfort. It was simply true. A second presence in his cabin wasn't a burden. Loneliness had its own weight. This was different. Asha took a slow breath and braced her elbows, trying to push herself upright. Pain flashed across her face, tightening her jaw. "I need to move," she whispered. "Not yet," Calder said. "You try standing now, you're going to fall." Her teeth clenched. "I don't want to lie here like I'm broken." Calder's jaw twitched. He knew that feeling better than she realized. "You're not broken. You're injured." "That's different." Asha stared at him, breathing uneven. But something in her shoulders eased. Calder stepped away to prepare more warm water, grinding herbs to help with swelling. He wiped down the table with methodical, careful motions, keeping his mind from slipping into places he didn't want her to see. He felt her eyes on him. After a long silence, she asked the question he had expected since the moment she woke. "Why did you help me?" Calder paused, the kettle handle warm under his hand. He took a breath before answering. "Because you were alive," he said. "Because leaving you wasn't something I could do." Asha blinked, absorbing it. Not dramatic, not tender, just honest. The crackle of the fire filled the room. Calder returned to her side and placed a hand lightly on her forehead. "Your fever's dropping," he said. Asha nodded, her eyes drifting shut, not from weakness, but from the sheer relief of knowing she wasn't dying anymore. Calder sat back in his chair, watching the fire dance across the logs. He'd already started planning what needed to happen: space for her to move, rails to build, clothes to sew, food to stretch through winter, unasked, unexpected, and irreversible. As the day passed, Asha drifted in and out of sleep. Calder moved around the cabin in quiet routines, mending tools, tending the fire, stepping outside just long enough to bring in more wood. Each time he came back in, he checked her breathing. Near evening, she opened her eyes fully. "Calder," she said softly, testing the sound of his name. "Thank you." He looked at her just long enough for her to see the sincerity in his eyes. Then he gave a single nod. "You're here now," he said. "That's what matters." Night wrapped the cabin again, but for the first time in years, he wasn't facing it alone. And for the first time since her tribe abandoned her, Asha wasn't lying on frozen ground waiting to die. The third morning crept into the cabin with a pale sheet of light, thin, cold, but steady. For the first time since Calder had carried Asha out of the snow, the day didn't feel shaped entirely by urgency. The fire held its warmth without constant tending. The air wasn't as sharp, and Asha's color had returned enough that Calder no longer checked her pulse every time she stirred. Still, habit kept him alert. He watched her as she woke slowly, blinking against the dim glow of the cabin. She lifted her elbows and pushed herself upright an inch, just enough to test her strength. And this time, she didn't immediately collapse back. Calder stepped toward her, ready to steady her if she slipped. "You're stronger today. I feel less hollow," Asha said. Her voice was thin, but had more shape than the day before. "My head is clear." Calder handed her a cup of willow bark tea, warm and earthy. She gripped it with both hands, her fingers trembling slightly until the heat settled into her palms. She watched him while she drank, studying him with the sharp, deliberate attention of someone who had spent a long time relying on instincts to stay alive. "You've been awake nights," she said. Calder didn't bother pretending otherwise. Fires don't feed themselves. That's not all you did. Her voice was soft, but direct. The kind that didn't demand an answer, just acknowledged one. He didn't respond. And that silence told her enough. After setting the cup aside, Asha pushed the blanket back and shifted again, leaning her weight forward. Calder recognized that look in her eyes, the stubborn resolve he'd seen in wounded soldiers who refused to stay down. Don't rush, he warned. I can't lie here until spring, she said. I need to learn how to move. You will, Calder said, but not all in one morning. I don't want you carrying me forever like I'm something broken. Calder met her gaze evenly. You're not broken. You're learning again. There's a difference. Asha looked away, her jaw tight. But she didn't argue. Calder walked across the cabin, looking at the space with new eyes. Table too high, bed too low, rails needed along the walls. He hadn't had to adjust his life for anyone in years. Out here, no one asked anything of him. Now, everything in the cabin had to change. He pulled a chair close to the cot and braced it against the wall. Try holding this first, he said. Asha reached for the chair, gripping it with steady arms as she pulled herself into a sitting position. She paused halfway up, breathing through the pain. Calder stayed close, not touching yet, not crowding, just waiting. When she finally sat upright, her legs hanging inches above the floor, her arms trembled from the strain. But she was up, and conscious, and present in a way she hadn't been since he found her. She looked around slowly, seeing the cabin from a whole new height, not from the bed, not from the floor, but from somewhere in between. A place she could claim. I need something to help me move, she said quietly. I'll build you rails. Calder replied. One here, another near the table, one by the door. She stared at him, surprised he had already planned that. Why? Because you'll need them, he said simply. Because I can make them. Asha looked down at her hands, absorbing the weight of his answer. Not pity, not obligation, just purpose. After a quiet moment, she lifted her eyes again. My legs. You didn't ask how. You'll tell me when you're ready. Asha nodded, relieved he hadn't pushed earlier. Then her voice dropped low, almost a whisper. A white soldier shot me during the raid. My tribe cut what they had to cut to save me. Then they ran. They needed to move fast before the soldiers returned. Calder's jaw worked. He'd seen that kind of choice too many times. They thought leaving me alive was enough, she said. But alone in winter, that's worse than dead. Calder didn't speak, not yet. Words like I'm sorry meant nothing when the world carved wounds that deep. Finally, he said quietly, not anymore. Asha looked at him sharply, searching for something. Pity, fear, judgment. She found none. Calder had the same steady expression he'd had since she woke. Reserved, grounded, unflinching. And somehow, that steadiness anchored her. Help me to the chair, she said suddenly. You sure? Yes. Calder stepped beside her and offered an arm, not grabbing her like she was fragile, but steadying her like someone he expected to fight through the pain. Asha used the chair leg and the bed frame to inch herself forward, pulling with her arms. Sweat gathered along her hairline. Her breath came tight, but she moved, inch by inch. She slid into the chair. When she finally settled, she let out a slow, trembling breath. Her eyes weren't defeated. They burned with something fierce. That's enough for today, Calder said. I can do more. You could. Calder replied, but you'd pay for it tomorrow. Slow wins. She closed her eyes briefly, accepting his words, because they weren't spoken from caution, but experience. A while later, as Calder prepared more broth, Ash's gaze drifted around the room. The shelves he built, the table he carved, the tools hanging neatly by the door. You made all of this, she murmured. Calder nodded without turning. Learned from my father. Learned the rest by not having anyone else to fix things for me. You live like a man who's had to survive alone. He snorted softly. That's one way to say it. Asha watched him a long moment. You carry guilt, she said. Calder's back stiffened. Just slightly. That's not your concern, he said. It isn't, she agreed softly. But I see it anyway. He kept his eyes on the fire, shoulders tight. But he didn't bark at her, didn't shut down. Something about her honesty slipped past the walls he'd built. Why did you leave scouting? She asked. Calder rubbed a hand over his jaw. I got tired of deciding who lived and who didn't. Asha nodded quietly. It was enough. Later that afternoon, he measured the walls for rails. She watched him work, asking simple questions: how he'd attach them, how soon she could try moving along them. He answered in his usual quiet way. As night softened the edges of the cabin, Asha's voice cut through the silence again. "Calder," she said, her tone calm and clear. "I'm not afraid here." Calder looked at her fully, meeting her eyes. "Good," he said. "You shouldn't be." Something shifted between them, not romance, not comfort, but the first fragile shape of trust. Outside, winter pressed hard against the world. Inside, warmth gathered around a people who had spent years surviving alone. And for the first time since she'd been abandoned, Asha didn't feel like she was fighting. For every breath, Calder didn't feel like a man meant to live without anyone beside him. They didn't name it. But both of them felt the beginning of something neither had expected. By the fifth morning, snow had piled high along the cabin walls, steep ridges of white reaching almost to the window. The sky outside was pale and sharp, the kind of cold that stung a man's lungs if he stayed out too long. But inside, the warmth held steady. Asha had finally slept deeply, her body responding to steady care, heat, and food. When she woke, Calder was already at the workbench, smoothing the edge of a new wooden rail. His movements were slow, precise rhythms he slipped into when his thoughts grew heavier than he liked to admit. "You work before the sun rises," Asha said, her voice still hoarse from sleep. Calder set the rail down and looked over. Used to getting things done when the world's quiet, she studied the faint shadows under his eyes, the pinch in his shoulders. A man who had lived too many winters alone, too many nights keeping watch with no one watching him back. "You didn't sleep," she murmured. "Enough," he answered. Though she could see the lie, she pushed herself upright, bracing her hands on the chair. "Let me try again today. I want to walk the rails." He moved to her side quickly, but not fussing, just careful. "We'll use the new one," he said, nodding toward the long rail leading toward the table. "Only if you're steady." Asha set her jaw. "I need to learn to live in this cabin, not wait for you to carry me." He wasn't surprised anymore by her determination, but that didn't stop the flicker of worry in his chest. "Slow steps," he said. "I'll be right beside you." With controlled breaths, Asha lifted herself forward. Her arms strained but didn't buckle. Fingers curled around the first rail. She paused, swallowing a gasp of effort. "Good," Calder said quietly. "Shift little by little." Asha pulled herself forward. One small movement, then another. Her breath hitched, her muscles shaking, but she held. Calder matched her pace exactly, the same way he'd once guided wounded soldiers through impossible terrain, steady, watchful, unspoken understanding. When she reached the end of the rail, a sheen of sweat covered her forehead. She rested her hands on the smooth wood, breathing fast but controlled. "That's enough for now," Calder said. "I reached it," she whispered. "You did." Asha leaned back, adjusting her weight carefully. Then her voice dipped into something softer, more vulnerable. "I was afraid I'd never be useful again, that I'd take up space I couldn't give back." Calder shook his head. "You don't owe this place anything. You being here doesn't require usefulness." She stared up at him, searching his face. "Then why help me at all?" He took a slow breath before he answered. "Because I saw someone who wasn't finished," he said quietly. "And because leaving you there would have stayed with me longer than anything I've done." Asha's breath steadied at the honesty. Her shoulders loosened, like something unseen had finally unclenched inside her. Later, Calder stepped outside to check the coop and clear the snow path. The cold air bit at his skin, sharp and thin. He scanned the land automatically, habit pulling his eyes to every ridge, every tree line, every open stretch of white. That's when he saw it. Faint tracks. Not his, not animal. Human. A single set of prints, faded by the night wind, but unmistakable. Someone had been close enough to see the cabin, close enough to know someone lived here. His pulse shifted, slow and heavy, squatting beside the tracks. He studied the distance between prints, the depth, the angle. One man, moving carefully, watching without approaching. That was the part that bothered him most. A drifter with nothing to hide walked on by. A scout, a soldier, or a man with questions stayed at the edges. Calder scanned the ridge. The trees. Nothing moved, but someone had been out here. When he stepped back into the cabin, snow melting on his coat, Ash's eyes snapped up instantly. She read tension the way a hunter reads wind. What happened? She asked. Calder hung his coat with deliberate calm. Someone passed through. Tracks near the ridge. Asha stiffened. Soldiers. Didn't look military, he said. But someone watched the place. Her fingers tightened on the chair. If they saw me, they didn't. Calder said sharply. Not unkindly, just certain. Asha swallowed. Do you think they'll come back? Calder crouched beside her. If they do, they'll speak to me first. And if they want me? She asked quietly. Calder's voice dropped into something like iron. This is my home. No one takes anything from it without going through me. Asha didn't smile, but her shoulders eased. Calder didn't make loud promises, he simply stated facts, and she believed facts. Later that day, he installed the next rail along the wall. Asha practiced moving between them, her arms trembling but stronger than the day before. Each time she shifted her weight, Calder's eyes followed, quiet, steady, ready. As the sun dropped behind the ridge, she finally asked the question sitting in the back of her mind since morning. Why did you choose to live out here alone? Calder didn't answer right away. He finished smoothing the wood rail, set the tool down, then turned. Because it's easier to live with the things I've done when no one else has to see the man. Who did them? Asha held his gaze with surprising softness. I see you now. He swallowed hard, but didn't look away. And you are not the man you think you are. The words hung between them, quiet, unforced, true. Evening settled around the cabin. Calder lit the oil lamp, golden light spilling across rough-hewn walls. Asha rested near the table rail, calmer now, her breaths even, her eyes thoughtful. I didn't think I'd ever feel safe again, she murmured. Calder didn't move, didn't straighten, didn't try to ease the moment with empty words. He just said, steady as the fire, you are, outside. The wind pressed against the walls, inside. Trust warmed the air between them. Asha fell asleep that night without bracing for danger. Calder stayed awake a while longer, not out of fear, but because for the first time in years, someone else's breath mattered to him, and that changed everything. The sixth morning arrived with a sharper wind than the days before, one that rattled the shutters and hissed through any gap it could find. Calder checked each window twice, stuffing scraps of cloth into the frames until the drafts stopped creeping in. Asha watched him from the rail near the table, her hands gripping the wood as she balanced upright. She had insisted on standing again today, pushing her strength a little further even as the cold pressed against the cabin walls. You don't have to rush, Calder said while tightening the last shutter. I'm not rushing, Asha replied. I'm learning. He turned toward her, taking in her posture. Her arms were still thin from weeks of hardship, but they held more steadiness each day. The rails had become an extension of her body, tools for reclaiming movement inch by inch. You ready to try the length of the wall? He asked. She nodded once. I want to reach the door. I need to know I can. Calder drew a slow breath. He understood this wasn't about exercise. This was about proving she could survive here, not as someone carried, but as someone capable. All right, he said. But we take it one section at a time. Asha pushed forward, her weight shifting carefully as she pulled herself along the rail. Calder moved beside her, hand near her elbow, but not touching unless she faltered. Every few steps, she paused to breathe. Then she pushed again. It wasn't graceful. It wasn't easy, but it was progress. At the halfway point, she rested her forehead lightly against the wood, letting her trembling arms settle. You want to stop? Calder asked quietly. Asha shook her head. If I stop now, I'll believe I can't. He nodded, not offering sugary encouragement, just accepting her resolve. Then breathe first. Don't fight your own lungs. She took several slow breaths, steadying herself. Then she pushed forward again. Bit by bit, she reached the far rail near the door. Calder opened the door slightly so she could see outside a sliver of winter light. Snow stretching across the land, the ridgeline sharp against the sky. Asha's breath hitched, not from pain, but from the sheer sight of it. She'd only seen the world through the window until now. Standing here, even supported, made it feel real again. It's different here, she whispered. Standing at the door, you earned it. Calder said. Her arms finally gave out, and Calder slipped an arm around her to guide her back to the chair. She didn't protest. She knew her limits. While she rested, Calder stepped outside again, clearing snow from the path to the coop. The cold slapped his face, but that wasn't what stopped him. Near the aspen line, a fresh broken twig, too fresh to be from the storm. Someone had moved along the tree line that morning. His jaw hardened. He scanned the area for prints, for shadows, for movement. Nothing, but he knew the signs. A watcher, someone cautious, patient. He returned to the cabin with the same quiet, controlled expression he used on dangerous trails. But Asha noticed anyway. "What did you see?" she asked. Calder pulled off his coat. Someone was near the woods again. Asha's face tightened. "The same person as before." "Can't be sure," he said, "but someone is watching the place." Asha's eyes dropped to the floor. "Because of me." Calder stepped closer, voice low and certain. "You don't know that. It's the only thing that makes sense," she said. "Soldiers hunt survivors. Settlers don't want an Apache woman anywhere near." "This land is mine," Calder said, tone sharp. "And you're under my roof." Asha looked up at him, seeing the protective set in his jaw, not anger at her, but readiness to stand between her and whatever came. "Teach me more," she said suddenly. "If someone comes, if you're outside, I need to know how to protect myself." Calder held her gaze. "You're not fighting anyone. That's not what I asked." Her voice wavered with conviction, not fear. "I want to live. I don't want to be taken because I can't stand." Her words hit him harder than she knew. He exhaled slowly. "All right, we start with the door." He pulled a knife from the shelf-old leather-wrapped handle, blade sharp. Asha stiffened, not in fear but in readiness. "You don't stab," Calder said. "Stabbing gets you stuck. You slash hands, arms make space, then move." She nodded, absorbing every detail. He showed her how to brace her body so she wouldn't slip, how to pivot using the rail, how to grab the rifle if she needed to. Her eyes stayed locked on his movements, soaking in survival like a language she already knew. Afterward, she bowed her head slightly. "Thank you." "This isn't thanks," Calder said. "This is preparing." Asha lowered her eyes. "Then thank you for preparing me." That afternoon the wind calmed. Asha tried moving again from the chair to the rail near the stove. Calder watched how her arms steadied faster, how her breath stayed controlled longer. "You're improving," he said. "Not enough," she murmured. "You've been practicing for days." "It feels like longer because your life is changing." Asha looked up, something softening in her expression. Not pride, not relief, but an acceptance she hadn't felt in a long time. As dusk fell, Calder cooked a simple stew. Asha watched the way he stirred the pot, steady, patient, methodical. She noticed things she hadn't before. How he always checked the corners of the room. How he listened for sounds outside even while his hands worked. How tension lived under his quiet. "You live like someone expecting danger," she said softly. Calder paused mid-stir. "Habits," he said. "Habits from what?" she asked, her voice gentle. He didn't answer at first. Then he set the spoon down and leaned against the table, expression hardening with memory. "I tracked men who didn't want to be found," he said. "Walked in gunfire because someone told me to. Watched people die for nothing. You don't forget that by building a quiet life." Asha nodded slowly. "You built this life to keep the noise out. Mostly. And yet you let me in." Calder's eyes met hers, steady, unflinching. "I didn't let you in," he said. "You were dying." "There wasn't a choice." "There was," she said softly. "You chose." Silence fell between them, warm, slow, not heavy. Later, as the fire dimmed and shadows softened across the room, Asha lay on the cot again. Calder sat near the hearth, sharpening a small knife in slow, steady motions. "Calder," she murmured, "if something happens, if someone comes, I don't want you getting hurt because of me." He didn't stop sharpening, but his eyes lifted to hers. "I'm not getting hurt," he said. "I've faced worse than anything out there. That's not what I mean." He waited. "I don't want you choosing danger for me." He set the knife down. "You're not danger," he said quietly. "You're someone who deserves to be alive." Asha swallowed hard. "I don't know why you think that. Because leaving you in the snow would have made me the kind of man I came out here to stop being." The words struck her deeper than she expected. Her breath trembled softly. Outside, the storm softened. Inside, the warmth wrapped around them both. Asha did not fear the night. Calder did not feel alone in it. Survival, for the first time in a long while, felt like something they were doing together. The seventh morning rose under a pale, washed-out sky, the kind that promised a storm but held its breath for now. Calder stepped outside before sunrise, eyes scanning the ridge line, the tree shadows, the open stretch of white between his land and the horizon. The broken twig from yesterday still pressed at the back of his thoughts. No new prints, no smoke, no shadows moving in the hills, but the feeling stayed, the quiet sense of being watched. Not a fear, but an instinct sharpened from years scouting men who didn't want to be found. Instinct like that didn't fade. When he stepped back inside, Asha was already by the table rail, holding herself upright with steady arms. "You looked for tracks," she said. Calder hung his coat and nodded once. "Nothing new today, but something's out there. Someone," she corrected softly. He didn't argue. He just glanced at the rail, noticed the way she balanced with more confidence than yesterday. "How are your arms?" he asked. "Sore," she said, "but not weak. That's the point." She pulled herself another inch. Her breathing hitched, but she didn't pause. Calder stepped beside her, ready to catch her if she slipped. "You're getting faster," he said. Asha looked at him, eyes searching his face. "Does that make you feel easier if trouble comes?" Calder didn't answer right away. He studied the determination in her eyes, the fire that hadn't existed when he first carried her in. "It makes me know you're not helpless," he said quietly. "And that matters." Asha absorbed the words slowly, letting them anchor her. Later that morning, Calder dragged a small wooden chest from under the bed and set it on the table. Asha watched with quiet curiosity as he unlocked it. Inside were objects she'd never seen him touch: a polished brass compass, a carved wooden pendant, an old folded letter, and a thick leather-wrapped journal. "What is all that?" she asked. "Pieces of my old life," Calder muttered. She pointed to the compass. "You used that as a scout?" "Many times. And the rest?" Calder closed the lid halfway. "Things from days I don't talk about." Asha studied him, gaze steady. "What did you do exactly, Calder Boone?" Calder's jaw tightened. He looked at the fire instead of her. "I tracked men who didn't want to be found. I found people who didn't want to be saved. Sometimes I had to decide who lived long enough to see another sunrise." Asha's voice softened. "You think that makes you a bad man?" Calder's breath caught in his chest. "Some of those choices." "Yeah." Asha braced a hand on the rail. "Then let me tell you something true." He looked at her. "A cruel man leaves a woman in the snow to die. A cruel man avoids the living. A cruel man fears being seen." Her voice tightened. "But a man who lifts someone with no legs and carries her home, he is not cruel." Calder swallowed hard and closed the chest. Her words hit deeper than he cared to admit. "You should rest," he said quietly. But she didn't look away, not yet. Something threaded between them, fragile but strong recognition, not pity. By midday, the wind softened. Calder guided Asha through another round of movement exercises. She made it from the cot to the table rail with fewer pauses, less fear. "You're thinking less about falling," he said. "I'm thinking about living." He let the words settle before nodding. "Good. Hold on to that." Asha hesitated, then said in a low voice, "Calder, when the man near the ridge comes back, and he will, what will you do?" Calder didn't try to soften anything. "I'll talk to him first, and if he comes with trouble, I'll turn him back, and if he wants me." Calder's voice dropped. "He's not leaving this land with anything he came for." Asha nodded once, absorbing everything his words implied. That evening, with the sun dipping behind the ridge, she attempted something new, pivoting from the table rail to the chair without help. Calder watched, tense but silent. Asha braced her arms, pulled forward, and eased herself into the seat with shaking arms and a tight breath. When she landed, she let out a small laugh, half disbelief, half joy. "You didn't think I'd make it," she whispered. Calder's mouth twitched. "I thought you'd make it. I just wasn't sure you'd let yourself." She looked down, breath trembling faintly. "I didn't know either." That night, as the shadows deepened and the fire burned low, Asha lay on the cot. Calder sat close by, sharpening a small knife with smooth, even strokes. She watched him, her voice soft. Calder, if something happens to you, what happens to me? He paused mid-motion, eyes lifting. I'm not planning on anything happening, he said. That's not an answer. Calder leaned forward, elbows on his knees. The fire lit half his face in orange light. Here's the truth, he said quietly. I'm not leaving you alone. Not by carelessness. Not by fear. Not by choice. Asha swallowed. A warmth she didn't recognize settled in her chest. Why? She whispered. Calder's single quotes, eyes didn't waver. Because you matter. Because I want you alive. Because I'm done running from things worth staying for. Silence filled the cabin. But it wasn't empty. It felt solid, like fresh-cut wood settling into place. Asha leaned back on the pillows, her voice barely a breath. I'm glad I found this place. Calder shook his head gently. You didn't find it. You survived long enough to reach it. She closed her eyes, her breathing even. Calder stayed awake beside the fire, watching over her until sleep tugged at him. And for the first time in years, he didn't feel like a man preparing for trouble. He felt like a man preparing to protect someone who already meant more than he expected. Winter pressed hard against the cabin, the storm gathering somewhere beyond the ridge. But inside, warmth held, strength held, and whatever came next, they wouldn't be facing it alone. The 8th morning broke under a cold, brilliant sky, the kind that follows a long bout of harsh wind. The air was still, almost delicate, and the sunlight glinted off the snow in a way that made the whole world look sharpened and new. Calder stepped outside just after dawn, closing the door behind him with quiet care. He scanned the ridge, the tree line, the frozen creek bed, every place a watcher might linger. Nothing, no tracks, no broken branches, no signs of anyone passing in the night. He released a slow, controlled breath. Not relief, just the easing of a knot he'd kept tight in his chest for days. Back inside, Asha was already awake, sitting upright with a blanket wrapped around her shoulders. Her eyes lifted immediately to his face. Nothing? She asked. Nothing. Calder confirmed. Her fingers relaxed around the blanket. The tension in her shoulders loosened. Good. After breakfast, she asked to practice again. Calder watched her closely as she moved to the rail near the stove. Her muscles were still tired from yesterday's push, but her balance had strengthened. There was determination in every breath she took, quiet, disciplined, fierce. Halfway across the cabin, she paused, not from pain, but from realization. I couldn't have done any of this days ago, she whispered. Calder stepped beside her. You did it because you didn't stop trying. Asha shook her head slowly. I did it because you built the rails, and you used them, he said. That's what matters. She reached the table rail and eased into the chair with careful control. Her breath trembled at the end, not from exertion, but from pride she didn't know how to express. I want to see the porch, she said suddenly. Calder blinked. You sure? Yes, a steady, certain yes. I need to see the world standing just for a moment. He didn't argue. He didn't hesitate. He grabbed his coat and wrapped it around her shoulders before lifting her, not like a burden, but like someone who had earned the right to be carried without shame. She held onto his shoulders naturally, trusting his steadiness. Outside, the cold brushed her cheeks. Calder set her down carefully on the wooden seat he'd built last year. Asha gripped the porch rail with both hands, fingers tightening around the smooth wood. Before her, the land stretched open, and endless white fields, dark tree lines, a sky so wide it felt almost unreal. Asha breathed in deeply. It's beautiful, she whispered. Calder stood beside her. It's home, she glanced at him. Yours, not mine. Calder met her gaze fully. Ours, if you want it. Her breath caught. For days she had wondered what she was to him, a burden he'd taken on, a responsibility he'd never asked for, something temporary. Why would you say that? She whispered. Calder rested one hand on the porch rail beside hers. Because you're not a burden, and you're not here by accident. You're someone I want here. Asha swallowed hard. Her voice quivered. Even like this. Calder didn't blink. Exactly like this. Her eyes softened, and she didn't look away. Instead, she studied him with the same quiet honesty she used for survival. You think I'm strong, she said. I know you are, and you think I belong here. Yes. She turned her gaze back to the land. Wind lifted strands of her dark hair. For the first time since she lost her legs, since the raid, since her tribe left her to die in the snow, she felt something settle deep inside her. Safety, belonging, choice. She placed her hand gently over Calder's where it rested on the rail, her fingers slipping into the spaces between his. "I choose this place," she whispered. "I choose this life." Calder's jaw tightened, not in tension, but emotion he rarely allowed to surface. "Then you stay," he said. Asha nodded. "I stay." The rest of the day carried a different rhythm, lighter, more sure-footed. Calder installed the final rail along the far wall. Asha practiced moving between them without being asked, slower as evening neared but more determined than ever. Her world had changed shape and she embraced every inch of it. As dusk settled in, Calder opened the small chest under his bed and pulled out something Asha hadn't seen before. A carved wooden support stick, polished smooth by years of use. "What is that?" she asked. "Something I kept from a man I respected," Calder said. "He carved it after he lost the use of his right leg. Helped him stand, walk, work." Calder turned it in his hand, thumb brushing over the worn edges. "I'm giving it to you." Asha's eyes widened. "I can't take that. It's part of your past." He shook his head. "It belongs to someone who needed to keep going. That's you now." Her hand trembled slightly as she reached out. Calder placed the support stick into her palm. It fit naturally, light, sturdy, a symbol of a future she hadn't thought she'd have. "Thank you," she whispered. "You earned it," Calder said. Every inch later, with the fire dimming and the cabin wrapped in deep, warm quiet, Asha settled onto the cot. Calder sat in his chair sharpening a tool, but he looked different, not as tense, not as guarded. "You look different tonight," she said softly. "How's that?" he asked, like a man who isn't alone anymore. He didn't smile, but a tiny nod acknowledged the truth. Asha closed her eyes, breathing slow and full. "I'm glad you found me," she whispered. Calder looked at her, the firelight reflected in his eyes. "I'm glad I did too." Outside, winter still gripped the land. Inside, warmth held deeper than fire, steadier than fear. Asha was no longer a woman abandoned in the snow. Calder was no longer a man living inside silence. Together, they had built something the world had tried to take from both of them, a home, a future, a choice. And as the embers glowed softly in the hearth, the story reached its true ending. She stayed. He stayed. And from that winter forward, neither of them would ever face the world alone again.